Have you ever noticed that when you start to question deeply, the people around you begin to retreat? They don't confront you directly, of course. They hide behind casual dismissals, behind well-meaning advice to not overthink things, or with that uncomfortable silence when you push a conversation beyond the surface. But deep down, what's really happening is simple. Your philosophical mind threatens their intellectual comfort, and no one likes to have their assumptions challenged. Perhaps you are going through exactly this right now. You started to ask different questions, seek deeper answers, maybe even doubt things you once accepted as immutable truths. And suddenly you began to feel isolated, misunderstood, dismissed as too intense. What no one told you, and what Nietzsche understood better than anyone else, is that this is the price of developing a philosophical mindset. Not just any kind of thinking, but a thinking so rigorous, so penetrating that it cuts through illusions like a scalpel through tissue. It exposes without debate the fragility of those who still live in the realm of unexamined beliefs. But why does this happen? Because a truly philosophical mind is a threat to intellectual mediocrity, and Nietzsche was clear about this. When you decide to question everything, to examine your deepest assumptions, and to abandon the comfortable sanctuary of received wisdom, you become dangerous. Dangerous to conventional thinking, dangerous to social pretense, and most importantly, dangerous to your former limited self. This video is a call, a challenge. It's not made for those who want their thinking validated, nor for those who seek simple formulas. It's made for you who is tired of being imprisoned by weak thinking, who feels on the brink of intellectual awakening, and who is ready to build something that no crowd can dismantle. A mind that no dogma can infiltrate. A mind that frightens because it does not accept. So if you feel ready for this path, a demanding, solitary, but absolutely liberating path, stay. Because what Nietzsche has to teach you will unsettle you, but it can also emancipate you. And after this, you will never think the same way again. Nietzsche was not just a philosopher. He was an intellectual warrior, someone who had the courage to question the most sacred idols of Western thought and strike them down one by one. And it is precisely in that intellectual battlefield where most retreat that he discovered the genesis of powerful thinking. Because for Nietzsche, it is not in consensus, comfort, or certainty that a human mind evolves. It is in doubt. It is in questioning. It is in intellectual courage. He wrote, "The snake, which cannot cast its skin, has to die. As well the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind." This is not poetic metaphor. It is epistemological necessity. It means that if you want to develop an unassailable philosophical mindset, you need to abandon the childish idea that it will emerge through reading the right books, memorizing clever quotes, or accumulating academic credentials. No, true philosophical thinking is born when you question your most cherished beliefs without flinching, when you stop demanding intellectual safety and start cultivating intellectual bravery. Think of the moments your mind expanded the most. Was it when your beliefs were confirmed? Or was it when they were shattered, challenged, forcing you to rebuild your understanding from fragments? Nietzsche believed that intellectual comfort was not the goal of thinking, but its greatest obstacle. He did not valorize doubt for its own sake. He embraced it as a tool. And if you can transform your relationship with uncertainty, with intellectual vertigo, with the anxiety of not knowing, you begin to forge something rare, a mind that doesn't seek refuge in certainty, but thrives in questioning. And it is precisely there that the world begins to be disturbed by you. Because while most flee from uncertainty, you will learn to dance within it. While others beg for simple answers, you will create complex questions. But this transformation requires a brutal break with everything you were taught about thinking. Thinking philosophically is not about winning arguments. It is not about intellectual performance. Thinking philosophically is dismantling the unexamined and emerging from the ruins more formidable. But Nietzsche knew that skepticism by itself is not enough. You can be paralyzed by it if you do not have a creative impulse, a constructive force. And that is why, in the next part, we will talk about the most decisive moment of Nietzschean philosophy, when he confronts nihilism and places upon you the full weight of intellectual creation. Because when there is no longer a fixed truth to hold on to, it is within you that meaning needs to be forged. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. When Nietzsche declared God is dead, he was not celebrating nihilism. He was diagnosing a crisis that many still misinterpret today. What he pronounced dead was not merely a religious figure. He announced the death of absolute authority. The death of the idea that truth comes from above, that meaning is bestowed rather than created, that values exist independent of human valuation. The death of God is the collapse of all external frameworks. And that is terrifying because until then it was comfortable to outsource the responsibility for your thinking. It was reassuring to believe that truth is something you find rather than something you forge, that meaning is discovered rather than created, that there are eternal verities that will anchor your thought regardless of context. Nietzsche violently tears this comfort away. He looks you in the face and says there are no facts, only interpretations. There is no objective truth waiting to be uncovered. Now you are the creator. And this is where the true construction of a philosophical mind begins. Because most people collapse when they realize there are no firm foundations, no unquestionable premises, no bedrock certainties upon which to build. But those who have the courage to face this epistemic vertigo without retreating, they begin to forge an unshakable intellect. With the death of God, Nietzsche pushes you into the abyss of radical intellectual responsibility. You should not defer to authorities. You must question them. You should not accept traditions. You must examine them. It is the birth of intellectual sovereignty. And along with it comes the burden. Everything now depends on your capacity to create meaning in a world that offers none inherently. There is no more intellectual security. There is no more comfort in certainty. Either you build your understanding or you sink into nihilism. But here is the secret. This intellectual vertigo that unsettles you is also the greatest source of mental power you can possess. When you understand that no one will provide you with ready-made truths, something within you awakens. A force that compels you to think more rigorously even while doubting. That forces you to question for yourself, to judge for yourself, to value not because someone declared it valuable, but because you determined it to be so. It is in this break with intellectual dependencies that Nietzsche prepares the ground for something even more transformative. The emergence of a new way of thinking. A type of philosophical mind that does not operate according to received ideas, who does not need validation or consensus, a mind that creates its own intellectual values, who surpasses conventional limitations and thinks as a creator, a mind that disturbs the intellectually timid because it forces them to see the fragility of their own thinking. This mind has a name. Nietzsche called it the free spirit, and it is about this that we will talk now. Because if you want to develop a philosophical mindset that destroys weak thinking, you need to understand how to become this figure who thinks beyond convention, guided only by their own will to truth. Nietzsche did not believe in the gradual improvement of human thought through education alone. He believed in rupture, in radical intellectual transformation, in philosophical revolution. And that is why he conceived the idea of the free spirit. It is not about an academic. It is not someone with institutional credentials. The free spirit is a mind that has overcome everything that constrains ordinary thinking. Intellectual conformity, conceptual laziness, the comfort of agreement, the need for certainty. The free spirit does not seek to be accepted in intellectual circles. He does not ask for permission to question. He creates his own intellectual standards and lives by them, even if that puts him against the entire academic establishment, and that is exactly why his thinking becomes unassailable, because it is not built on the approval of intellectual authorities. It does not need external validation to justify itself. It is self-sufficient. It draws strength from its own will to truth, the deep impulse to see reality as it is, not as convention dictates it should be seen. This is the central point. The free spirit does not adapt to intellectual fashion. He imposes rigor on a world of lazy thinking. He does not seek intellectual comfort. He seeks intellectual integrity. He does not ask, "Do others agree?" He asks, "Is this thought worthy of me?" And this shift in perspective changes everything. Because when you start to see yourself as a creator of meaning, not as a consumer of ideas, the way you think, question, and understand transforms completely. But here lies the problem. Becoming this kind of thinker requires sacrifice. You will have to kill parts of yourself that still crave intellectual approval. You will have to face the anxiety of standing alone in your understanding. You will have to bear the weight of constructing a worldview from scratch, without guarantees, without the validation of experts, without the comfort of consensus. And most people cannot handle it. They retreat before they advance. They run back to the safety of established schools of thought, unexamined assumptions, and ideas that someone else has already validated for them. The path to the free spirit is intellectually demanding, and Nietzsche knew this. He himself lived beyond the intellectual fashions of his time. Misunderstood, called a madman, isolated from the academic world he was trying to revolutionize. But it was in that intellectual isolation that he found his freedom. And this is what you need to understand. The more philosophical your mind becomes, the further you drift from conventional thinking, the deeper you question, the more you disturb. The construction of the free spirit is the most demanding and liberating process any thinker can undergo because it requires you to dismantle everything that is not authentic, everything that has been imposed on you by intellectual tradition, by an education system that rewards repetition and punishes original thinking, and only after this demolition do you begin to build. But this construction does not happen within the academy. It happens in intellectual solitude, in private questioning, in the deep examination that separates the philosophical mind from the conventional one. And that is exactly why in the next part we will dive into the most neglected and most powerful aspect of this journey, the solitude of the thinker. Because the truth is that to become philosophically formidable, you will have to learn to think alone, and few are ready for that. Are you? If there's something that no one tells you about the path of philosophical development, it's this. The more rigorously you think, the more intellectually isolated you become. And it's not because you distance yourself by choice. It's because conventional thinking starts to appear insufficient to you. Nietzsche spoke clearly about this. The philosopher, the one who questions the unquestionable, who does not accept comfortable half-truths, who thinks beyond established categories, inevitably separates themselves from common opinion. And that separation is disorienting. But that disorientation is necessary because real intellectual growth requires independence. And you can't grow while being tied to the consensus of others. Most people live within an invisible framework of unexamined assumptions where every thought is constrained. Every question is limited by what's deemed reasonable. You've become accustomed to thinking within acceptable boundaries, judging like others judge, feeling secure because your thoughts are echoed by those around you. But what Nietzsche proposes is the opposite. He breaks you away from that security and throws you into the wilderness of original thought. In that wilderness, there are no guides, no pre-drawn maps, no well-worn paths. There's only you, your uncertainties, your contradictions, your mistakes, your temptation to retreat to familiar territory. And that's where the real test begins. Because what will most people do? They will run back. They will once again hide behind received wisdom. They will pretend they don't wonder, that they don't doubt, that they don't see the inconsistencies. But you, if you truly want to become someone whose thinking cannot be dismantled, will have to remain. You will have to endure the vertigo that reveals the true nature of philosophical inquiry. Nietzsche said, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." That is the essence, the ability to think differently. The rarest and most powerful achievement any mind can attain. Because when you truly think for yourself, no dogma can limit you. No authority dictates your understanding, and no consensus can impede your inquiry. But this intellectual sovereignty comes with the weight of isolation. You will lose intellectual companions. You will be misunderstood. You will hear that you are pretentious, difficult, unnecessarily complex. They will try to drag you back into conventional thinking. They will call you impractical, overthinking, disconnected from reality. But that is the price of not being intellectually domesticated. It is the price of not needing agreement. It is the price of not thinking as a reflection of popular opinion. And here is the unvarnished truth. If you cannot withstand intellectual solitude, you are not ready for philosophical freedom. Because all real intellectual progress comes with abandonment. Abandonment of intellectual comforts, of unexamined assumptions, of conveniently simple worldviews. That's why Nietzsche saw intellectual solitude as an achievement, an arena where genuine thinking finally has space to develop. But this philosophical mind, this liberated intellect, does not just think alone. It begins to see what others refuse to see. And with that comes the second inevitable effect, the confrontation with intellectual laziness. Because when you start to think rigorously, collective intellectual complacency detects it and it responds. And that is exactly what we will talk about next. The danger of intellectual conformity. Because the world does not pursue those who think the same. It pursues those who dare to think differently. Nietzsche did not fear censors, intellectual gatekeepers, or declared enemies of free thought. What he feared and exposed with philosophical precision was the subtle and pervasive power of intellectual conformity. That invisible mechanism that keeps all thinking within acceptable boundaries, that punishes those who question foundational assumptions, that rewards intellectual obedience and disguises mental laziness as pragmatism. True suppression of thought, according to Nietzsche, does not come from explicit prohibition. It comes from tacit agreement. It comes from the intellectual community that insists you remain unchallenging so that they do not have to re-examine their premises. And that is exactly what happens when you start to think differently. When your questions become sharper, your analysis more penetrating, your insights more unsettling, you begin to provoke resistance, not because you're thinking incorrectly, but because you are thinking too clearly. You are exposing the inadequacy of conventional thought. And intellectual establishments cannot tolerate those who expose inadequacies. Collective mediocrity of thought cannot tolerate individual philosophical rigor because that rigor exposes the superficiality of common understanding. Nietzsche called this the herd mentality, a way of thinking built by those who, unable to face difficult questions, decided to label them unanswerable. They transformed intellectual courage into arrogance, philosophical depth into obscurity, independent thought into contrarianism. And with that, they created an intellectual environment that protects the superficial and dismisses the profound. But make no mistake, it is not out of intellectual humility. It is out of intellectual fear because the weak thinker does not want to be strengthened. They want strong thinking to be discredited. That is why when you start to develop a truly philosophical mindset, they begin to marginalize you. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly with dismissals, misrepresentations, reductionism. But the message is clear. Return to acceptable questions. You are making us confront our unexamined assumptions, and you are unintentionally simply by thinking as you do. Nietzsche understood that most people exist in a state of intellectual hibernation, a mental life shaped by convenience, tradition, and unacknowledged bias. And anyone who disturbs this state is treated as problematic. But do not be misled. Intellectual conformity does not attack with censorship. It attacks with trivialization, with mischaracterization, with the soft power of subtle discrediting. It will attempt to make you question your intellectual capacity. It will make you think you are wrong for asking difficult questions. It will use all rhetorical weapons from ridicule to misrepresentation to make you doubt your philosophical instincts. And it is at this moment that many surrender because they cannot bear to be the difficult, the demanding, the philosophically rigorous. But Nietzsche would give you another name, necessary. Because while the world revolves around comfortable half-truths, easy answers, and intellectual shortcuts, it is the philosophical mind that brings the necessary discomfort for genuine understanding to emerge. Your philosophical rigor is the catalyst for intellectual evolution, but it is also the target of resistance. Thinking deeply, questioning thoroughly, examining rigorously. All of this is an act of defiance against weak thinking. And like any defiance, it requires preparation. It requires tools, but not external tools, internal ones. And that is exactly what we will talk about now in the final part, because there is a very high cost to developing a philosophical mindset that destroys weak thinking. But there is also a reward that no external force can diminish. In the next part, you will understand the price and the power of being intellectually indomitable. You made it this far. That already distinguishes you from the majority. Most people would have abandoned this video at the first challenge to their thinking. They would have retreated at the first intellectual discomfort. They would have clicked away the moment they realized this is not content designed to validate existing beliefs. It's an intellectual provocation, a provocation for those who are prepared to release comfortable certainties and confront reality with ruthless clarity. Because developing a philosophical mindset so powerful that it dismantles weak thinking is not just an intellectual choice. It's a form of intellectual sacrifice. You will lose. You will lose intellectual companionship based on agreement rather than truth. You will lose opportunities that demand intellectual compromise. You will lose the capacity to be satisfied with shallow understanding. But in exchange, you gain something invaluable: intellectual integrity, analytical clarity, philosophical depth. You will begin to notice that most people think in patterns they never chose, and that your philosophical clarity is unsettling, that your intellectual rigor makes others uncomfortable, that your analytical precision reveals contradictions others prefer to ignore. This philosophical power does not come from credentials. It is not acquired through academic titles, nor is it developed through intellectual fashions or borrowed wisdom. It is forged in the crucible of honest questioning, in the solitude of independent thought, in the choices that no audience applauds. It is the outcome of an intellectual revolution between what you were conditioned to think and what you have chosen to examine. And this revolution has no conclusion because the truly philosophical are not those who have arrived at final answers. They are those who continue to question even when they could comfortably stop. Nietzsche did not want to create disciples. He wanted to ignite intellectual transformation. He wanted you to stop settling for comfortable half-truths, to stop accepting unexamined premises, to stop seeking in established systems what can only be built through rigorous, independent, and courageous thought. He wanted you to become intellectually dangerous, not in an aggressive sense, but in a transformative sense, so transformative that your very approach to thinking compels others to confront what they have been avoiding. And now I want to invite you to do something that will crystallize this process. Write in the comments a question you have been afraid to ask, an assumption you are ready to examine, a belief that you suspect may not withstand philosophical scrutiny, but that represents an honest intellectual challenge. This is part of the journey. Finding your questions, developing your examination, and more than that, declaring that you will no longer think weakly. And if this video resonated with you, if something within your mind was awakened, don't conclude here. The next video continues this intellectual journey. And if you've reached this point, you recognize you're not watching merely out of casual interest. You are here because something within your intellect has already begun to transform. So continue. You are not isolated. You are just ahead. And that, my friend, is intellectually challenging, but it is also philosophically liberating.